Somewhere in the South Pacific, it is 0200 hours. The water is glass. 80 feet below the surface, an American submarine crew is holding its collective breath. The setup is perfect. It is the kind of shot captains dream about. A massive Japanese freighter, fat with oil, silhouetted against the moon. Range 700 yards. It's point blank. You could throw a rock and hit it. Fire one. Thump. Whoosh. The hull kicks. You feel the sudden drop in pressure as 3,000 pounds of steel leaves the tube. The stopwatch starts clicking. Tick, tick, tick. The crew is calm. They aren't praying. They aren't hoping. They know. In 20 seconds, that freighter is going to vanish in a fireball. They are already waiting for the cheer. 18 seconds, 19 seconds, 20 seconds. Nothing. No explosion, no fire, just a dull metallic thud that reverberates through the water like a hammer hitting a tombstone. The freighter doesn't sink. It doesn't even slow down. In the control room, the confidence evaporates instantly. They look at the stopwatch. They look at each other. Because right now, 80 men are realizing the exact same terrifying truth. The enemy isn't the ship up there on the surface. Before we open the case file on the deadliest scandal in Navy history, a quick briefing. If you respect the silent service and want the truth about the hardware they fought with, make sure you're subscribed. The Legion is growing, and we need all hands on deck.
Now, let's look at the pattern.
If that moment had happened once, you could call it bad luck. You could call it a mistake. But in the first months of the war, that hollow thud wasn't an anomaly. It was a plague.
It was happening everywhere, from the freezing gray swells of the North Atlantic to the tropical heat of the Java Sea. Different submarines, different captains, different targets.
The reports started flooding into headquarters, and they all sounded like the ramblings of madmen. The best commanders in the fleet, men who could thread a needle with a submarine, were coming back with empty tubes and 0 kills.
They described impossible things. Torpedoes that swam right under the hull of a ship like they were allergic to steel. Torpedoes that exploded 500 yards too early, hitting nothing but water. And the duds, God, the duds.
One captain reported firing 15 shots at a single Japanese converted cruiser. He heard 13 impacts, 13 metal-on-metal collisions.
And the cruiser didn't sink. It just turned around and started dropping depth charges on it.
The crews started to question their own sanity. They checked the math, they checked the gyros, they checked the tubes. Everything was perfect, but the result was always the same.
They were risking their lives to get into the perfect position, pulling the trigger and then watching their lethal weapon bounce off the enemy like a rubber toy.
It wasn't an accident. It was a pattern.
Different crews, different oceans, same nightmare.
For a while, the crews treated it as a joke, a dark, bitter joke about American craftsmanship. But then, the joke stopped being funny because men started dying.
Here is the tactical reality of submarine warfare. You only get one shot at surprise. The torpedo isn't invisible. It leaves a wake, a trail of bubbles on the surface that points a giant white arrow right back to your location.
When a torpedo works, that wake doesn't matter because the enemy ship is exploding. But when it fails, when it hits with a loud clang and alerts every sonar operator within 10 miles, that wake becomes a death sentence.
Imagine the terror. You fire, you wait, you hear the dud hit the hull, and then you see the enemy destroyer turn. He's not sinking, he's furious, and he knows exactly where you are.
Suddenly, the submarine is forced to go deep. They are forced to burn battery power. They are pinned down for hours, hammering the hull with depth charges, bleeding oxygen, terrified.
The light bulbs shatter. The cork insulation peels off the walls. Men are thrown against the bulkheads, bleeding from the ears, all because their own weapon betrayed them.
Boats were lost. Good men, men who had done everything right, never came home. Not because they made a mistake, but because they trusted the machine. It wasn't just a defective weapon anymore.
It was a silent liability. It was a saboteur welded into the hull, waiting for the worst possible moment to ring the dinner bell for the enemy. In war, you are taught to fear the tangible threats, the Zero fighter diving out of the sun, the destroyers sprinting at 30 knots, the depth charge sinking through the darkness.
But in 1942, the Japanese Imperial Navy wasn't the biggest threat to an American submarine. The Japanese were predictable. You could outsmart them. You could hide from them.
The real enemy was invisible. It didn't appear on sonar. It couldn't be spotted through a periscope. It was far more dangerous because it was written into the very DNA of the U.S. Navy. It was the doctrine, the assumption, the unshakable, arrogant belief that we know what we're doing. The American Naval Command had convinced itself that it had solved the mathematics of war. They believed that if a weapon worked on a blueprint, it would work in the ocean. They believed that if a test was successful in a laboratory, it was successful in combat. They fell in love with their own reflection. They looked at their shiny new technology and saw victory. They didn't see the salt. They didn't see the rust. They didn't see the chaos. This blindness created a terrifying paradox. The crews were fighting two wars at once. They were fighting the Japanese for control of the Pacific, and they were fighting their own leadership for permission to tell the truth.
History likes to say we were fighting the Empire. But ask any sub-skipper from 1942. The most dangerous enemy in the Pacific wasn't Japanese steel. It was American confidence.
The ghost in the machine finally had a name. It was the Mark 14 steam torpedo. And on paper, it wasn't just a weapon, it was a miracle.
To understand why the Navy defended it so hard, you have to look at the price tag. In 1940, a single Mark 14 cost $10,000. That's about $200,000 today. Every time a captain yelled fire, he was throwing 5 brand new Cadillacs into the ocean.
It was the most complex piece of machinery the Navy had ever built. It was developed in absolute secrecy at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. It was faster than the enemy, it had a longer range, and it carried a secret inside the nose cone that was supposed to change naval warfare forever.
The Mark 6 magnetic exploder.
The concept was brilliant. Old torpedoes had to hit the side of a ship to explode, but the Mark 14 was designed to be smarter. It sensed the magnetic field of the steel hull and detonated beneath the ship.
It didn't punch a hole in the side. It created a massive gas bubble under the keel that lifted the entire ship out of the water and snapped its spine in half. One shot, one kill. That was the promise.
It was a weapon designed by geniuses. It was polished, calibrated, and certified as perfect.
But there was a catch. Because it was so expensive and because it was so secret, the geniuses never actually fired a live one at a real target. They tested it with dummy warheads. They tested it in calm, shallow water. They tested it in a polite freshwater bay in New England.
They built a weapon for a laboratory, and then they shipped it to the most violent, salt-corroded, chaotic environment on Earth.
That was the tragedy of the Mark 14. It had been tested everywhere, except in war.
When the reports of failure started piling up on the desks in Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance, the agency responsible for the torpedo, faced a choice. They could trust the math on their blueprints, or they could trust the word of the men in the Pacific.
They chose the blueprints.
The response from the Bureau was swift, arrogant, and absolute. They didn't launch an investigation into the weapon. They launched an investigation into the crews.
Imagine the insult. You're a submarine skipper. You've just survived a 20-hour depth charge attack. You're exhausted, shaking, smelling of diesel and fear. You write a report saying, "I hit the target perfectly. The torpedo was a dud."
And 3 weeks later, a memo comes back from a clean, air-conditioned office in D.C. It doesn't apologize, it accuses.
The torpedo is functioning as designed. The failure is due to crew error.
They blamed everything but the machine. They told veteran commanders they were firing too deep. They said their aim was bad.
They claimed the sonar operators were hallucinating the hits. They even implied that captains were firing early out of cowardice, anxious to clear the area. It was gaslighting on an industrial scale. They looked men in the eye, men with salt stains on their collars, and told them they didn't know what they were seeing. The Bureau pointed to their freshwater tests in Newport. "Look," they said, "it works here, so if it's failing out there, it's your fault." They prioritized the simulation over the reality. They protected the reputation of the device by sacrificing the reputation of the sailors. It was the ultimate disconnect of the war. The official position of the United States Navy was that an office thousands of miles away knew better than the men being shot at. There is a limit to how long a soldier will listen to a bureaucrat. By mid-1942, the Pacific Submarine Force had reached that limit. You could see it in the faces of the skippers walking into the officers' club at Pearl Harbor. These weren't rebels. They weren't trying to start a revolution. They were professionals who were watching their friends die. Admiral Charles Lockwood, the new commander of the submarine fleet, watched the boats come in. He saw the clean sweeps, submarines returning with no kills. He saw the empty bunks.
He knew the smell of a boat that had been hammered by depth charges for 12 hours because a torpedo failed to detonate. He knew the look in the eyes of a 19-year-old kid who realizes his own Navy doesn't believe him.
Lockwood was different. He didn't care about the patent rights. He didn't care about the ego of the designers in Newport. He realized that morale was a finite resource, and his fleet was running on fumes.
Every time he sent a boat out with Mark 14s, he felt like he was sending them out with wooden guns. The captains were desperate. They were literally running out of patience, running out of targets, and running out of crews.
The Bureau kept demanding more data. They wanted more reports, more memos, more proper channels.
But Lockwood looked at the charts. He looked at the casualty lists, and he decided he was done writing letters.
He realized that the time for argument was over. The Bureau wanted proof, but Lockwood, he didn't need proof. He needed the killing to stop. If the bureaucracy wouldn't test the weapon in the conditions of war, Lockwood decided he would bring the war to the test. But he couldn't replicate a laboratory. He didn't have sensors or telemetry gear or high-speed cameras.
So he improvised. He came up with a solution that sounds like something a farmer would invent to catch a fox. It wasn't scientific. It wasn't Navy regulation. It was, honestly, kind of ridiculous.
Frenchman's Bay, Australia, June 1942. Lockwood orders a submarine, the USS Skipjack, to pull into the calm, shallow waters.
And then he orders a couple of officers to go out and buy a fishing net.
Not a special naval barrier, just a standard hemp fishing net. He strung it across the bay, weighted it down with anchors, and marked it with buoys.
It sounds simple, right? But think about the risk. If this failed, if Lockwood was wrong, he wasn't just wasting a $10,000 torpedo, he was destroying his career. This was a court-martial offense. He was betting his stars and the lives of his men on a piece of string.
The Bureau in Washington would have laughed. They would have called it crude. They would have said, you can't measure complex hydrodynamics with a fishing net.
But that was the point. They had spent years measuring the torpedo with math. Lockwood wanted to measure it with reality.
He understood the new rule of the Pacific. When formal testing fails, reality becomes the laboratory.
The skipjack lines up. The range is 850 yards. The depth setting on the torpedo is set to 10 feet. According to the manual, that torpedo should run exactly 10 feet below the surface.
Fire 1. The torpedo streaks away. It hits the net. There's no explosion. Lockwood used a dummy warhead to save weight, but there is a clear splash. It pierces the mesh and keeps going.
Lockwood sends a diver into the water with a tape measure. This is the moment of truth.
The diver swims down to the 10-foot mark.
The mesh is solid. No hole.
He swims down to 15 feet.
Still solid.
He keeps descending, past the weeds, down into the gloom. Finally, at 21 feet, he finds it. A jagged, violent tear in the hemp.
21 feet. The torpedo was set for 10. It was running 11 feet deeper than the dial said.
That doesn't sound like much on land, but at sea,
If you fire at a destroyer with a draft of 12 feet and your torpedo runs at 21, you miss by 9 feet. You don't scratch the paint. You pass harmlessly underneath, leaving nothing but a wake and a furious enemy.
This was the smoking gun. It wasn't crew error. It wasn't bad aim. It was a broken ruler. The Bureau had been sending men to war with a weapon that literally couldn't hit the target it was aimed at.
Washington was terrified, not because the weapon was broken, but because their entire reality had just been shattered by a fishing net. Their math said it was impossible. The hole in the net said the math was a lie.
And if you're enjoying this kind of deep military history, where we dig into the dirty details they leave out of the textbooks, make sure you're subscribed. These stories don't surface often.
The depth test should have been the end of it. Lockwood sent the data to Washington, and begrudgingly the Bureau accepted the fix. They calibrated the pressure valves, the torpedoes started running straight.
But this is where the story turns from a scandal into a horror movie. Because once the torpedoes started actually hitting the ships, we found out that the depth mechanism was just the first layer of the rot.
It was a cascade of failure. With the depth fixed, the torpedoes swam at the right level, but then the magnetic exploders started failing. They were detonating 50 yards before the target, spooked by the wrong magnetic waves.
So Lockwood ordered them disabled. Turn them off, he said. Make it a simple impact weapon. If we hit them, we kill them.
So they deactivated the magnets. Now the torpedoes ran at the right depth, they ignored the magnetic fields, they slammed physically into the steel hulls of Japanese tankers.
And then, clang.
The contact exploder, the firing pin designed to set off the warhead, was flawed. It was designed so poorly that a perfect 90-degree hit, the hardest shot you can make, would jam the firing pin rather than triggering it.
Think about that. If you made a sloppy shot, it worked. If you made a perfect shot, the torpedo broke.
It wasn't one bug, it was the entire architecture. The depth sensor was calibrated for the wrong ocean, the magnetic fuse was too sensitive, the contact pin was too fragile.
It was a Russian nesting doll of incompetence. Every time you fixed one problem, you revealed a deadlier one underneath.
The Bureau of Ordnance had achieved a statistical miracle. They had built a machine where every single component worked perfectly in theory and failed absolutely in reality. By late 1943, the repairs were finally made. The depth springs were stiffer, the magnets were gone, the firing pins were milled from new alloys.
And suddenly, the Mark 14 woke up. It stopped being a liability and started being the predator it was promised to be.
The results were terrifying. In the final 18 months of the war, the U.S. submarine fleet, armed with working torpedoes, strangled the Japanese Empire. They sank more tonnage than the rest of the Navy and the Army Air Forces combined. They wiped the Japanese merchant marine off the map.
You watch the gun camera footage from 1944. You see tankers breaking in half. You see ammunition ships vaporizing in mushroom clouds. The American wolf packs were unstoppable. But looking at those burning ships doesn't feel like victory. It feels like a tragedy of arithmetic. Because you can't help but look at the calendar. The war started in December 1941. The torpedo didn't work until late 1943. That is nearly 2 years.
2 years of missed shots. 2 years of convoys slipping through the net to resupply Japanese garrisons. 2 years of American submarines being hunted down and sunk because their ambush failed.
How many Marines died on the beaches of Tarawa because the ships carrying the Japanese ammunition weren't sunk 6 months earlier? How many sailors died in the Solomons because the enemy fleet had plenty of fuel?
The delay wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a transaction. We bought the Bureau's pride with time.
And the men on the front lines paid for it with blood.
If you want more real stories like this, where small decisions shape entire wars, leave a like on the video. It tells the algorithm that this history matters. That blood is the permanent record of the scandal. It's what happens when you value a clean report over a dirty reality. But the Mark 14 wasn't a malfunction. It was a warning.
A warning that was ignored.
And this wasn't the last time that blind confidence, internal politics, and suppressed reports would destroy something massive. Because 2 years later, across the Pacific, the exact same mindset was building another disaster.
Only this time, it wasn't a 20-foot torpedo. It was the largest aircraft carrier ever built.
A ship constructed under the same illusion of invulnerability, a ship commanded by the same refusal to face reality, and a ship that would meet a fate just as preventable as the Tullabee.
We've told you the story of the weapon that wouldn't work. Now, you need to see the story of the ship that couldn't float.
The case file on the Shinano and the submarine that hunted her is already open.
Click here to see what happens when the systemic blindness builds a mountain of steel and then tries to sail it.
Dismissed.